It was August of 2011.
We went to a family cottage, and my sisters and brother and all the kids were there. And Matthew, just swimming, he got really cold, and we noticed the bruising on him. And one of my family members, who is a nurse, suggested that we take Matthew in. So that's when our world started to turn upside down.
Little did we know by how much. Quite frankly, it is the worst nightmare of any parent. I was lost.
Unfortunately, I believe it was the next day, we got the word that it was acute myeloid leukemia and FLT3, so a very aggressive form.
So the treatment for that involved he'd be hospitalized for months. Basically, this diagnosis, first and foremost, being a life-threatening situation for Matthew. I mean, it created a sense of powerlessness over the whole family.
And underwent our first bone marrow transplant, which seemed to go really well. And after 5 weeks, it failed.
It involves basically, wiping out the child's immune system, among other things. So he's incredibly vulnerable to anything, and the precautions involved in ensuring that he would have a successful transplant was incredible. The list of things that we had to ensure.
So we had to undergo now a second transplant.
Guy was chosen. Unfortunately, it wasn't a perfect match, and so it eventually the second failed. It was
just unimaginable to have gone through 2 transplants and then for it to fail.
Yeah. The failure of the second engraftment followed shortly thereafter by being told that he had relapsed. The leukemia was back. And
at that time, the doctors came to us and gave us a choice on how to proceed. Whether we attempt to go for a third transplant, which most of the doctors were not recommending. They felt that Matthew had less than a 5% chance of survival, or we go home and go the palliative route. And it was not a week I would ever wish on anyone else again. And so we, with our son's guidance, we decided to go for the third transplant. So it was a tough time. We went through the chemo, we had the third transplant, and we went through that, and that went really well. When that happened, we went from one ward in the hospital where we were really, really pleased with their processes. They followed policy, even his line care. And so we had to go to another ward to have his chemo again to get him into remission before that third transplant. And that ward did not follow the same policies. And I let my guard down in watching the nurses all the time. And we ended up with a line infection, which we think is just from nurses not scrubbing the hub, not taking as much care with Matthew. Matthew suffered, though, a number of setbacks. He had a stroke, he had a lot of swelling in the brain, encephalitis,
and
shingles.
There's all these hurdles, and we're running out of options by this point. Think to yourself that all this is so preventable, that it just added to an already mountain of concern and fear. And then to know that, like Di says, we're being told that he has a less than single-digit chance of survival. To have to navigate through a procedure to replace a line due to infection. It's devastating. Along Matthew's journey, he's into his third transplant, and we still are holding on to hope. Sure enough, it was getting redder and redder, and
oozing and hussy, and they talking to the staff. They were monitoring it. They didn't change the protocol, And we were becoming very concerned because, again, the infection could have killed him, and being so at his site and so close to the heart.
And this is his last
Very
shot.
scary.
This is, he's been through so much chemo. He was lucky enough to get a third transplant. So we can't fool around here. This is his life we're talking about.
So the CHG dressing with the chlorhexidine patch was recommended to us, and we talked to the hospital about that, and there was nothing they could do. They couldn't provide that type of dressing. It wasn't permitted. We brought the information into them, and they approved letting us use this dressing, and so they started applying it for Matthew, and we haven't had a single infection. And we now have home care that is as well following us with and using this. I have to say we're still vigilant that the nurses take proper care of Matthew, but there are times when I feel like, why do we have to be so vigilant and so aware? Why isn't the medical community
More consistent.
exactly? Especially initially, it was incredibly difficult to tell nurses or whomever it may be. I think you didn't scrub the hub enough. Can you please?
See, you
Exactly.
gotta understand that we don't want to be the difficult parents, but it's
You had to. We had to at times.
You're talking about an 8, 9-year-old boy who has no immune system. We're being told that if he's gonna fail at this, it's gonna be due to infection. Like, he will die, more likely based on some sort of infection that he gets. So
Our son's life depends on the care that he receives when we're in the hospital.
Please keep me safe and my line clean, which will make my mom and dad happy too. Keep me safe and my line clean, which will make my mom and dad happy too.